Resuming debate.
And the honourable member for Elmwood-Transcona.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm rising today to share some reflections on behalf of the NDP with respect to the final version of the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement, as it's formally known, or as it's known by many, simply the new NAFTA. Before delving into the details of the agreement, I think it's important, I want to give some context to Canadians who may be listening at home. Donald Trump was elected President of the United States in 2016, claiming that, quote, NAFTA was the worst deal ever. Well, no one in Canada would question the significance of our trading relationship with the United States to the Canadian economy. There are many Canadians who would rightly question who the big winners under NAFTA have been. The original NAFTA was negotiated by Conservatives and signed by Liberals in 1994. People were promised jobs, rising productivity, and secure access to the largest market in the world. But during the years since NAFTA was signed, Canada lost over 400,000 manufacturing jobs, and its textile industry was devastated. While automation has played a role in those job losses, there's no question that many of those jobs moved to Mexico because it was a low-wage economy that could sell finished products back into Canada and the US without penalty. Just ask auto workers from Southern Ontario. Half of Canada's current manufacturing trade balance with Mexico is made up of cars and parts. The overall automotive trade deficit between Mexico and Canada has gone from $1.6 billion to $8.7 billion under NAFTA. In addition, Canada has paid millions of dollars in court fees and penalties when sued by corporations under investor-state dispute resolution mechanisms. Perhaps most memorably, the Canadian government was successfully sued by a US chemical company, Ethel Corporation, in 1997. For having dared to try and ban the import and interprovincial trade of the gasoline additive known as MMT. Now, MMT is a suspected neurotoxin that automakers also claim interferes with automobile onboard diagnostic systems. Under the NAFTA, Ethel won a settlement with damages totaling $19.5 million, but that wasn't it, Mr. Speaker. The Canadian government was also forced to overturn the regulatory ban and issue a formal apology to the corporation. It was a stark example of how international trade agreements could override the authority of democratically elected governments to make rules in the public interest. In this case, rules meant to protect human health and the environment. Canada has been challenged more than any other country under NAFTA Chapter 11. Other cases against Canada include challenges to wildlife conservation measures, provincial water and timber protection policies, fracking in the St. Lawrence River Basin, and the sale and use of pesticides. The proportionality clause in the original NAFTA also challenged Canada's energy sovereignty, allowing the United States to require a significant share of Canada's oil and gas production be sold to our southern neighbours, whether it was in Canada's national interest or not. Over the decades under NAFTA, Canada's GDP and cross-border trade no doubt grew, but wealth inequality also grew. And today, Canadians are finding it harder and harder to make ends meet. Each month, 48% of Canadians right now are within $200 of not being able to pay their bills or defaulting on their debt, Mr. Speaker. What I'm trying to say that I think Liberals and Conservatives are far too quick to gloss over, far too often, is that it hasn't been all sunshine and roses under NAFTA. And while the rich were getting richer, far too many Canadians were left to fall behind. While governments and trade tribunals were and are quick to defend corporate rights and bail out big companies when their risks don't pay off, when things go wrong for workers, they're offered simple condolences. Or maybe they're told that they need to accept that, well, that's just how the market works. Or that they're the victims of downsizing or global restructuring, as if these things were natural events like earthquakes or snowstorms, and not the result of calculated human decisions designed to maximize shareholder profit at the expense of everything else. In other words, Canadian workers have a lot to be upset about when it comes to trade deals and the global corporate agenda that drives them. And that is also why there's been a growing political backlash across the Western world directed at these kinds of agreements. Nevertheless, 25 years under NAFTA has led to an integrated North American supply chain for many businesses and has created confidence for many entrepreneurs that they can invest in cross-border commerce without fear of the kind of arbitrary reprisal we've seen from time to time for certain industries, like, for example, softwood lumber, the cattle industry, and most recently, steel and aluminum. The understandable desire to maintain that confidence, coupled with an economic interdependence that grew under NAFTA, explains why so many Canadians were concerned when Donald Trump moved to renegotiate the deal. The president's own personality compounded that concern. To say the least, he's a known bully who's quick to throw even his closest allies under the bus when it suits his short-term political needs. But instead of leaning into the possibility of renegotiating and improving the deal, the Liberals' first instinct was to say that the original NAFTA was the best deal that Canada could get. They were not the ones to propose the elimination of Chapter 11 and the investor state dispute settlement mechanism that gave Ethel Corporation its win over Canadians' health and the environment. In fact, they initially said that they would fight to keep it. It was only once the U.S. made it clear that it would insist on renegotiations that we really started to hear the government admit that the deal was not perfect and that it could, in fact, be improved. Suddenly, better was possible after all. To hear that NAFTA had flaws was no surprise to New Democrats. But to hear that from the mouths of Liberals, who had spent years mocking New Democrats for saying as much, certainly was a bit of a shock, Mr. Speaker. As usual, just like Liberals and Conservatives before them, this Liberal government engaged in a highly secretive negotiation process. While a broader range of stakeholders may have been consulted, there was no information made available to the public or to Parliament. In fact, we're still waiting for some basic economic analysis of the agreement from our government, something a number of our trading partners not only make available, but make available early on in the process. And I'll have more to say on that later, Mr. Speaker. At the end of the first round of bargaining, the Liberals declared once again that we had the best deal that Canada could get. But what New Democrats saw as an agreement that hammered the supply-managed dairy sector, increased the price of already high-cost prescription drugs, and continue to put the rights of corporations on a pedestal without offering real protection for the rights of workers and the planet. Thankfully, even though our government was eager to pack it in, Democrats in the United States shared some of those concerns and signaled their intention to fight for a better deal. In spite of the promise of a better deal, Liberals in Canada were rushing to ratify it. And the only real criticism they were getting from Conservatives at that time, a short 6 or 7 months ago, was that they weren't ratifying it quickly enough. When the NDP called on the government to delay ratification until the Democrats' campaign to improve the agreement had run its course, and to seize the opportunity to push for something better, we were met with a combination of outrage and scorn. For example, Mr. Speaker, the Deputy Prime Minister told us in May 2019, and I quote, "Mr. Speaker, what the NDP needs to understand is that reopening this agreement would be like opening Pandora's box. Why is the NDP prepared to risk our economic stability? It would be naive for the NDP to believe that Canadians would benefit from reopening this agreement. The NDP is playing a very dangerous game," end quote. In June, she continued along the same vein, saying, quote, "We do not want and we do not need a new NAFTA negotiation. Canada has done its work. We have our deal. We are not going to create an opportunity to have this one agreement put in jeopardy." There are more examples, Mr. Speaker, but I don't wish to belabor the point. I simply want to point out that happily, the Liberals were not able to ratify the first version of CUSMA before last year's election. The Democrats continued their work, and they made some meaningful improvements to the agreement. It turns out the game the NDP was playing was the one that would allow for the elimination of measures that otherwise would have raised the cost of prescription drugs. Turns out we were playing the game that allowed for the establishment of first-of-their-kind provisions for binding, enforceable, and internationally monitored labor standards in Mexico. That may have been a dangerous game for pharmaceutical companies looking to maximize their profits on the backs of the sick. It may have been a dangerous game for companies looking to drive out competition by moving their manufacturing to a low-wage economy like Mexico. But I don't think we can say it was a dangerous game for everyday Canadians trying to pay for prescription drugs or worried about their job moving south. There are still real concerns for many Canadians, and I suspect the Big Pharma and the Big Three will still find a way to make money, although maybe not quite as much. The problems have not all been fixed, but Canadians will be a little better off than they otherwise would have been thanks to the hard work, not of this government, who wanted to rush ratification, but of U.S. Democrats who weren't willing to throw in the towel so easily. Canadians shouldn't have to depend on politicians in foreign countries to get a better deal at the bargaining table. They should be able to have confidence that their government is at the table fighting for them instead of acting at the behest of corporate lobbyists. One of the ways that we can give Canadians that reassurance is by making our trade process more open and transparent and involving Parliament at the outset. We can build confidence in the process by formalizing the consultation process so that Canadians know when, where, and how they'll be able to express their hopes and concerns with respect to a prospective trade agreement, and ensuring that all the right people, organizations, and institutions are consulted. We can build confidence by having the government clearly and formally state its objectives for the negotiation, by having a debate and vote in Parliament on those objectives before formal negotiations begin, by requiring the government to prepare and publish economic data and analysis on the likely impact of a deal. These are things that to many would seem to be simple common sense, Mr. Speaker. Why shouldn't Canadians have a right to know how they'll be consulted on trade issues instead of having a different process every time? Why should Canadians feel confident their government is fighting for them if it won't be transparent about its goals? How can Parliament play a truly meaningful role in setting Canada's trade policy if it can only debate and vote on the merit of trade with a country once a deal has already been signed? How can Canadians and their elected representatives be truly expected to judge the value of an agreement with no economic data or analysis? And yet, Mr. Speaker, this is the very situation that we find ourselves in. Before my colleagues and other parties begin dusting off their straw men to say things like, "You're talking about negotiating in public. You can't do that. You don't understand trade." Consider this, Mr. Speaker, because we've heard that many times before in this place. The executive in the United States is required to give at least 90 days notice of its intent to enter trade discussions with another country to Congress. Congress is able to define trade policy priorities and specify negotiation objectives. The executive is expected to honor those objectives in its negotiations, and Congress can set out consultation and notification requirements so that it's satisfied the executive is actually following through. In other words, legislators in the United States have far more authority and involvement in the trade process, and yet they were still able to conclude a deal. Didn't mean they couldn't get a deal done. The sky didn't fall. Americans had more information about what their government was trying to do at the bargaining table, but it didn't impede them from getting a deal. In the European Union, the very first step in the trade process is for their executive to prepare an assessment of the likely economic impact of a proposed deal. They publish their negotiating directives online before negotiations even begin. The executive publishes online a report of each negotiating round and its initial negotiating proposals. The Commission also informs the European Parliament at every stage of the talks about the latest developments. When the EU is close to finalizing the text of a deal, the Commission tells Parliament and informally sends the final text to EU member states and the Parliament. That's only a summary of some of the highlights of the EU trade process. It may be that some members found that tedious, but if so, they should reflect on the fact that despite all that consultation, all those steps, all that sharing of information, the EU has been quite capable of negotiating trade agreements, including the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement it recently signed with Canada. In Canada, we have no formal process at all. The government is free to go to any country in the world and negotiate and sign any deal they want. They don't have to tell anyone. They don't need any parliamentary approval. In fact, the only reason Parliament is studying the deal at all is because the implementation requires changes to the law. But by the time we get to that stage, the deal itself is already signed and negotiations are already concluded. Mr. Speaker, I want Canadians to know that we don't have to do it that way. And adopting some of the practices of our trading partners could make for a more open, democratic, transparent, and accountable trade process in Canada. It can do that without jeopardizing our ability to get a deal. That's a false argument. Mr. Speaker, we know because we have deals with places that do those very things, Mr. Speaker. And the time to set up that kind of process is now, Mr. Speaker. It's right now. It's while we're talking about this deal. It's while we're concluding this deal. It's while it's in the media. It's while people are paying attention. Because if we wait, the issue may not draw public attention again, and I worry it may not draw the attention of the government either, until the next negotiation, say between Canada and the United Kingdom, which may not be that far away. And once that process has already started and is in the news, it'll be too late to do it right, which is why we should set it up now. That's why the NDP has called on the government to move quickly on the institution of a proper trade process for Canada, and we look forward to substantive discussion about how best to move forward on that in this Parliament. To conclude, I want to come back to the substance of the agreement, Mr. Speaker. I mentioned already that the NDP looks favorably on the elimination of Chapter 11 and the proportionality clause. We are, however, concerned about the so-called good regulatory practices chapter and whether it will continue to put downward pressure on public interest regulation, making it harder to create and maintain regulations for the public good. We're concerned about the requirement that Canada consult the United States before entering into negotiations with any non-market economy. Unless we bring in a meaningful domestic trade process, this means that the U.S. government will have more right to know about Canada's trade intentions than our own Parliament, which makes no sense to me at all, Mr. Speaker. We're encouraged by the new provisions enabling monitoring and enforcement of labor standards in Mexico, but we want to better understand how exactly those are meant to work. Study at committee will be a good opportunity to do that. Nous avons entendu des...
We heard concerns about the chapter on digital trade, and we want to hear from experts on the implications that the deal will have for Canada's digital economy. We share the concerns of dairy producers and aluminum workers, and we want to hear the government saying what its plan really is to help producers and workers in those sectors after CUSMA is ratified. We're looking for answers to those concerns, and that's why we want to study the bill. That's why we voted yesterday to allow the government to table the bill. No trade deal is perfect, but we're keeping an open mind, and we'll be asking some questions to go a little bit deeper. One, will this version of the agreement leave Canadians better off than the previous one? We want an answer to that question. Question two, will the ratification process lead to a trade process that is more transparent and more accountable to Canadians? We are anxious to move forward and get answers to those questions in the coming weeks. Thank you.
Questions and comments, questions et commentaires.
Questions and comments, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. The Minister, on behalf of the government, working with the negotiators and the many different stakeholders, I believed achieved the optimum agreement that we could have achieved given all of the circumstances over the last number of years. But I also get it. The Conservatives believe that if they were in government that they could have negotiated a better agreement. The NDP believe that if they were in government they could have negotiated a better agreement. The Green Party believes if they were in government they could have negotiated a better agreement. But what is encouraging is that we have seen those parties along with the government, support the principle of the fact that this is a better deal than the previous agreement. And we saw that in the sense in terms of the vote that took place yesterday, right? And having that agreement passed provides additional support for the Canadian economy. All Canadians benefit by it. And I guess, Madam Speaker, the question that I would have for my friend and colleague across the way is that I am actually very encouraged in regards to the trade file and the positioning and the speech that the member across the way has provided the House this afternoon, and would ask him, is there something very specific that would come to his mind in regards to the old agreement, anything within the old agreement that he believes has been lost in regards to a negative way with respect to this new agreement?
The Honourable Member for Elmwood-Transcona.
Yeah, I'm not sure if there was a double negative there, but I mean, certainly as I said in my remarks before, some of the things that are out of the agreement that were there before that we think constitute an improvement are the elimination of Chapter 11 and the proportionality clause. And one of the things that I take the honourable member's point that, it is often the case in partisan politics that parties tend to have a lot of confidence in their own ability to secure better agreements than their opponents. But the point for us is that Canadians should be able to judge that by having a uniform and formalized process where the government is required to disclose its objectives in a way that allows Parliament to debate and comment on them, that allows Parliament to have a vote before the negotiations begin, that provides adequate economic data and analysis to be able to assess the impact of a deal. And we should be moving in that direction so that it's not up to Canadians to simply decide who they're going to trust when we all say we could get a better deal, but that they have the facts that they need in order to be able to make an assessment about who really could make that better deal and what the government is actually doing at the negotiating table and what they intend to get for Canadians.
Hear, hear.
Des commentaires, questions?
Questions and comments?
Honourable member for Oshawa.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and I want to thank my colleague from the NDP. And I also want to welcome him to International Trade Committee, and I'm really looking forward to his enthusiasm and his commitment to making sure that this is a good deal. He mentioned issues that we share in common, the issue of sovereignty, about our responsibility as opposition to do our due diligence. We are simply asking, we've asked the government in December for 7 questions. One of them was really to look at the economic impact studies. And I think he shares our concern that the government would like us to rubber stamp this without even having proper economic impact studies. And one of the issues that's really important for Ontario, and particularly my community, is the effect of this deal on auto workers and our auto sector. And I was wondering if you could take a few moments and just talk about the importance of this deal and the part that has benefits for auto workers.
The honourable member for Elmwood-Transcona.
Thank you very much. Well, of course, the North American content requirements, I think, are good for auto workers. So when we talk about having 75% of the vehicle made here in North America, I think that's a good thing. I think some of the guarantees around steel and aluminum content, although there's more work to do on the aluminum side to make sure that the kind of that the primary level production is also happening within North America in order to support aluminum workers in Quebec, to be sure, but also in British Columbia, where there's also aluminum production happening in Canada. So those are definitely some good things and some steps in the right direction. I think one of the questions that I would want to see answered in an economic impact analysis that we have, and we haven't heard these figures from the government, is we have a 70% steel and aluminum guarantee on paper, but nobody's actually said what the current percentage is. So if you take the North American rules of origin in the new agreement and apply them to the current economic scenario, right now, is it 40% North American steel and aluminum in cars? Is it 80%? Is it 90%? Is it 10%? We don't actually know, and we haven't heard from the government. And if we had a proper economic impact analysis, those are some of the facts and figures we would expect to see there so that we could judge what this actually means. Because if we're already at 80%, it's having a 70% guarantee isn't that impressive. If we're at 40, it's certainly a lot better. So that's why we think that information is crucial to get as we study this deal.
Questions et commentaires?
Questions and comments?
L'honorable député.
The honourable member for Jean-Pierre. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I appreciated my colleague's speech. He talked about the negotiation process, which wasn't transparent enough, and I agree with him somewhat. I don't know if he would agree with me to say that there should be a mechanism to allow the provinces to give their opinions on multilateral agreements. With an agreement such as NAFTA, we could have a process that would mean that the Canadian economy wouldn't just be thought of for its Western oil or member for Elmwood-Transcona. Clearly, there are provincial interests that are involved in such trade agreements. So I think it makes a lot of sense for the provinces to be able to be consulted. We saw a little bit of this with CETA, but I think that the big problem or issue is that there's no formal process. Even if there is a good consultation with the provinces on one agreement, nothing guarantees that the same thing will happen with another agreement. So it's high time to have a concrete and formal process in place that gives Canadians rights and all various levels of government so that they can be heard in the process.
Questions et comments?
Questions and comments?
Honourable member for, sorry, wrong page. The honourable member for Fleetwood Port Kells.
Madam Speaker, actually, I'd like to take the opportunity to ask the honourable member, re-ask a question that my colleague tried to ask a little earlier, just to make sure we're clear on the nature of that question. And that is, was there anything in the old agreement, the agreement actually that's currently in force, that we lost, that we should have tried to preserve? That's the question.
Honourable member for Elmwood-Transcona.
Well, I don't know how long the honourable member has been following the trade file in Canada, but if he had been following the debate at the time of the original NAFTA, I think he would find that on the New Democratic bench, we were more concerned about what was in there that needed to be taken out than what was in there that needed to be preserved.
Questions et commentaires?
Questions and comments?
Show up.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I'd like to address another question to my colleague. My friend from Quebec mentioned the issue with the aluminum, and the government really put forth a very green agenda in their trade missions, and I think all of us in the House can be very proud that the aluminum produced in Quebec is the greenest aluminum in the entire world. And it seems that there still is some skepticism and some concern about how aluminum is being treated. And I'd specifically like to talk to my colleague about the concern that has been brought forward in the media, perhaps, that there is some stockpiling of aluminum in Mexico. It may be there from China, and there could be a route coming around the back end, whereas the quality of the aluminum, the fact that it's not produced in North America, and there could be a back door. Could my colleague please address this issue and why it was an opportunity lost that we didn't negotiate a better deal for our aluminum manufacturers, considering we're the greenest aluminum in the entire world?
Very, very quick answer from the member from Elmwood-Transcona.
Things. One is that it absolutely has to be the priority of the Canadian government to protect the interests of Canadian producers and make sure that to the maximum degree possible, Canadians are being hired to produce materials like that. Secondly, I would say to my honourable member, what we need is enforceable environmental provisions where we get our trade partners on board with reducing their emissions as well as our emissions so that things like green aluminum can be fought for under a trade agreement. And I'd love to see cooperation from my Conservative colleagues on that in the future.
Reprise du débat.
Resuming debate. The